Dawn broke over the Rhine like a dying ember. The air smelled of oil, mud, and burned timber. It was March 7th, 1945, Remagen, Germany. Mist rose from the cold river as thunder rolled from distant artillery. The bridge ahead, the Ludendorff Bridge, hung in ruin. Its steel girders sagged, blackened by explosions. The Germans had blown it hours earlier to halt the Americans. Yet as smoke drifted over the riverbanks, something impossible was happening. U.S. engineers were already swarming the wreck, sparks flying as acetylene torches cut through twisted beams. To the stunned townsfolk watching from shattered windows, it looked less like rebuilding and more like resurrection. Only the night before, the Wehrmacht had believed the Rhine would hold. Hitler himself had ordered that every crossing point be destroyed. "Not one American shall cross alive," his directive read, sent down from the Führerhauptquartier, Oberkommando de Heers, March 1945. But the 9th Armored Division, racing under Brigadier General William Hogue, had reached Remagen faster than anyone expected. Against all odds, they found the bridge still standing, until German engineers detonated the charges too late. The explosion crippled it, but didn't send it into the river. Hours later, American engineers arrived, men with hard hats and tool belts instead of rifles, from the shattered riverbank. The locals watched with disbelief. They had seen American bombers obliterate rail yards, tanks roar through cobblestone streets, and P-47s scream overhead. But this was different. These soldiers were not destroying, they were building. Sergeant Joseph Delicio of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion led a crew dragging steel cables through the rubble. "We'll have her up before sundown," he muttered, his face caked with soot. His men worked as rifle fire cracked across the river. Snipers picked at them from church towers, but the engineers didn't flinch. The war was measured in minutes now, and every second counted. The bridge trembled with life again. Bulldozers groaned. Cranes swung like mechanical giants. A pontoon section slid into the current, tethered with ropes thick as wrists. German civilians standing near the tunnel mouths whispered prayers. They had been told the Americans were monsters, that they would burn everything. Instead, they watched men risk their lives to rebuild what their own army had destroyed. One old woman clutched her shawl and whispered, "They build bridges faster than we can destroy them." Her words would echo across the valley, repeated in diaries and letters long after the shooting stopped. Behind the effort was a machine of logistics that few civilians understood. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had been preparing for this moment since Normandy. Every truckload of steel, every Bailey bridge panel, and every crate of rivets had been cataloged, marked, and shipped through depots stretching back to Antwerp. Engineers like Captain John L. Grimm of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion coordinated replacements, parts, and welding rigs with mechanical precision. If a bridge went down, one report noted, "We had another halfway built before the dust settled." U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Field Report, 1945. It was industrial warfare at its purest. Organization turned into power. While riflemen held the far shore, the engineers fought their own battle against current, weight, and time. Steel trusses were dragged into place, bolted by torchlight. Communication wires buzzed with updates. Each span completed meant one more Sherman tank, one more fuel truck, and one more ambulance could roll east. German officers across the river could hardly believe what they were seeing. "They repair in hours what we destroy in days," one officer wrote in his field diary, dramatized composite. To them, it was sorcery, a kind of mechanical black magic powered by gasoline and disciplined at BY noon. The clang of hammers drowned out the river's roar. American combat engineers, many barely 20, worked with the rhythm of a factory floor. Sparks danced on their sleeves, and rivets hissed in the air like tracer rounds. Some men sang to keep their nerves steady. Others worked in silence, lips pressed tight. The bridge creaked beneath their boots, but the structure held. Each section welded meant a life saved. Each bolt tightened meant another mile toward victory. On the West Bank, medics patched wounds beside stacks of lumber. War blurred the line between destruction and creation, and in that blur, American ingenuity thrived. From the hills above, German civilians peeked through shattered walls. They could not comprehend how men who had been enemies an hour ago could rebuild what bombs had torn apart. To them, the scene was surreal. a bridge of steel reborn under fire. Children pointed at the giant cranes and whispered that the Americans must have brought them across the ocean. In a way, they were right. Those machines were part of a global supply line. Tens of thousands of ships, hundreds of ports, and millions of tons of material. Every beam that rose over the Rhine was the end result of a continent's worth of coordination. That evening, as twilight fell, the first convoy rumbled across. Jeeps, trucks, and M4 Shermans rolled over the patched bridge, the steel groaning but holding. The river below reflected their headlights like fireflies on black glass. Civilians stood in silence. Some wept. For years, they had watched armies tear their world apart. Now, for the first time, they saw a different kind of army, one that could rebuild faster than ruin could spread. Private Raymond Buckley, an engineer from Kansas, looked up at the German crowd and said quietly, "You can't bomb progress." His remark was scribbled in a war correspondent's notebook. Later published in Stars and Stripes, news of the feat spread faster than the tanks themselves. Allied headquarters couldn't believe the reports. The bridge had been declared destroyed that morning, yet by dusk, vehicles were rolling east. Photographers captured the impossible. American engineers working through smoke and shellfire, laying planks where dynamite had just torn steel. Within hours, the images reached London, then Washington. One correspondent called it the miracle of the Rhine. But for the men who built it, it wasn't a miracle. It was procedure, training, determination. Years of drills turning chaos into motion. The miracle was that they survived long enough to finish the job.by midnight. The bridge was a lifeline. Artillery units followed, then infantry, then supply trucks carrying ammunition and fuel. Engineers slept where they stood, helmets resting against girders still warm from welding. Across the river, the German command realized what had happened. The Rhine, Germany's last great natural barrier, had been breached. Hitler erupted in fury, ordering the execution of officers responsible for the bridge's failure. But the truth was simpler. No defense could withstand the sheer speed of American reconstruction. The engineers had turned a crippled crossing into a highway for an army as dawn neared again. The Rhine shimmered with smoke and light. American soldiers stood guard on both ends of the bridge, rifles glinting in the haze. Beneath them flowed the river that had once divided empires. The civilians who had watched the day before remained by the banks, silent, awestruck. They had witnessed something they could scarcely name, a moment when destruction met its equal. They had seen men turn ruin into victory, not with fury, but with fire, sweat, and steel. And as the rumble of engines carried eastward into the night, the question began to spread. If the Americans could rebuild this fast, what else could they do next? The secret behind the miracle at Remagen wasn't divine intervention. It was engineering discipline forged in factories, blueprints, and blood. Months before the Rhine crossing, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had perfected a method of rebuilding under fire. Their advantage wasn't a single invention, but an entire philosophy: mobility through construction. Every man trained to build could also fight. Every vehicle carried not just ammunition, but also steel, wood, and cable. In the words of Colonel James B. Anderson, "We don't wait for bridges. We bring them with us." U.S. Army Field Engineering Doctrine, 1944. That doctrine, tested across France and Belgium, now defined modern warfare. The Allies had learned their lesson in Normandy. When the Germans blew bridges across the Seine and Meuse, Allied advances slowed to a crawl. Tanks stranded, supplies choked, and divisions stalled. To prevent that again, American engineers designed a solution that bordered on industrial magic: the Bailey Bridge. Invented by British engineer Donald Bailey in 1941 and perfected in American factories, it was a modular marvel, panels of high-tensile steel pinned together without cranes. Each could bear 40 tons, sometimes more, depending on reinforcement. War Department Engineering Manual, 1943. A section could be carried by 6 men, assembled like a child's toy, and deployed in less than 4 hours. By the time U.S. forces reached the Rhine, entire convoys of trucks were loaded with Bailey components. From Detroit to Pittsburgh, factories ran around the clock to stamp and weld the panels. Women riveters, nicknamed Bridge Angels, produced thousands per week under War Production Board contracts. General Electric supplied the acetylene torches. Caterpillar built the bulldozers that cleared debris. Ford adapted its truck lines to haul the massive loads. The combined might of American industry was crossing Europe on its own assembly line. When engineers at Remagen began welding, they weren't improvising. They were executing a rehearsed industrial ballet. The Germans, on the other hand, had no answer to such speed. Their engineers were masters of fortification, not improvisation. The Wehrmacht could destroy bridges with precision but lacked the logistical flexibility to replace them quickly. Every demolition was a victory, one German sapper later wrote. But the Americans treated it like a nuisance. Post-war technical debrief. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Their doctrine assumed time, days or weeks of delay, yet the Americans operated on hours. Behind the front, engineer depots hummed like factories. Parts were cataloged by weight, load rating, and fitment. Trucks moved with mathematical rhythm. Guided by a new technology, radio coordination, field radios, specifically the SCR 300. Walkie-talkie developed by Motorola gave American engineers a command network that the Germans could only envy. Using VHF frequencies between 40 and 48 MHz, crews could call and supply trucks, cranes, or reinforcements instantly. Signal Corps Technical Manual TM11 to 242, 1944. When one pontoon failed, replacements were rerouted within minutes. When sniper fire intensified, field artillery adjusted based on engineer coordinates. Every hammer swing, every welding spark, was backed by invisible lines of communication humming across Europe. What civilians saw as spontaneous reconstruction was, in truth, a symphony conducted through radio waves. The hidden advantage extended beyond tools. It lived in the training culture. American engineers were drilled to work under fire. Fort Belvoir, Virginia, had trained over 30,000 combat engineers by 1945. Recruits learned to weld blindfolded, to estimate bridge loads by sight, and to construct temporary spans while artillery thundered in the background. If you can't think through fear, you can't build through war, one instructor told his cadets. Fort Belvoir Training Memo, 1943. That mentality carried to the Rhine. When the Ludendorff Bridge trembled under tank weight, men scrambled beneath live fire to reinforce the beams. They didn't retreat, they recalculated. The decisive moment came 2 days later, at Erpel, just upriver from Remagen. The Germans had managed to demolish another key crossing, sending the Erpel rail bridge into the Rhine. The current was stronger, the bank steeper, and the debris thicker. Yet within 10 hours, American engineers began constructing our placement, an M2 Treadway bridge, a floating highway of pontoons and steel decking. Using outboard motors and cable anchors, they stabilized the structure against the current. The operation was overseen by Colonel Basil W. Wyman, commanding officer of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. His men, soaked and shivering, worked through the night under intermittent mortar fire. The scene was chaos turned to order. Searchlights pierced the smoke. Cranes dipped pontoon sections into the black water. Boats ferried cables between banks, their motors coughing in the cold. Each pontoon was 10 feet wide, inflated by hand pumps, and connected by iron couplings. Within hours, the span stretched 1,200 feet across the river, capable of supporting 60-ton tanks. Engineer Operations Report, March 1945. The German artillery fire intensified, shells exploding in geysers around the floating bridge. Yet the work continued. They built as if death were an inconvenience. Noted one German observer, dramatized composite. Civilians hiding in cellars could hear the rhythmic clang of hammers even between barges. What stunned the Germans most wasn't the technology, it was the tempo. Every action seemed prescripted and rehearsed. Engineers worked in teams of 12, each man knowing his role without a word spoken. While some reinforced the pontoons, others prepped decking. Supply trucks arrived synchronized to the minute. Even under shellfire, cigarettes dangled from lips, wrenches turned, and boots stomped through icy water. The American Army had industrialized not just production, but behavior. It war fought like a factory shift, efficient, tireless, and relentless. By dawn, the first convoy rolled across the M2 bridge. The river, still boiling from explosions, reflected the steady procession of armor and trucks. A German officer, watching through binoculars, muttered, "It's as if they built a new Rhine overnight." His disbelief mirrored that of the townspeople. To them, the Americans weren't just invaders. They were architects of motion, turning rivers into highways and wreckage into logistics. The bridge vibrated beneath the weight of tanks, but the structure held. A new path into Germany was open. While engineers worked on site, a separate battle raged behind the lines, the supply war. The Red Ball Express, manned largely by African-American drivers, delivered the steel, fuel, and lumber that made such feats possible. Over 6,000 vehicles operated daily, carrying 12,000 tons of cargo from depots in France to the Rhine front. Quartermaster Operations Log, February 1945. Without that artery of material, no bridge could stand. Every rivet that clicked into place carried the echo of Detroit forges, Kansas lumber mills, and Pennsylvania coal furnaces. American engineers didn't just build bridges. They embodied the entire economy of a continent on the move. As the Remagen and Erpel crossings solidified, the German command fell into panic. Hitler ordered special bridge killer units to target the structures with V-2 rockets and jet bombers. But even successful hits proved temporary. Each time, the Americans rebuilt faster. "We hit it in the morning, and they cross again by nightfall," wrote a Luftwaffe officer in despair. Luftflotte West Operations Diary, March 1945. The rhythm was unstoppable. It wasn't technology alone that stunned the Germans. It was the revelation that destruction no longer slowed the enemy. For the first time, demolition had lost its power. The bridge builders became legends among the infantry. Soldiers nicknamed them steel ghosts, men who appeared from the smoke, rebuilt what seemed lost, and vanished before dawn. They carried hammers instead of rifles, yet their work killed no one and saved thousands. Their bravery was quiet but immense. Every beam they lifted was a defiance of gravity and war itself. When the Rhine crossings were finally secure, more than 25,000 vehicles had rolled east in a single week. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. By the third week of March, German civilians along the Rhine no longer feared the engineers. Some even approached them, offering bread or water. The soldiers accepted with nods, but no words. They were too tired to speak. Their faces were streaked with soot, their hands blistered, but their eyes were fixed eastward. The bridges behind them stood as monuments of determination. To the locals, they seemed indestructible. To the soldiers, they were temporary steps toward victory. And as the last beams locked into place, the river that had divided nations became a single, trembling artery of progress. The hidden advantage, the power to rebuild faster than war could destroy, was now undeniable. But what this speed did to the human spirit on both sides of the river was something no manual could explain. When the bridges over the Rhine held, something far greater than steel had been tested. It was the endurance of will. To the Allies, crossing the Rhine meant breaching the heart of Hitler's empire. To the Germans, it was the final collapse of their defensive dream. Yet for the engineers, the victory was personal, a triumph of precision over panic, of calculation over chaos. In their notebooks, they sketched stress diagrams beside tally marks for fallen comrades. Each line of steel carried a name, each bolt a memory. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen became more than a crossing. It was a symbol that Germany could no longer stop the machinery of Allied progress. Strategically, the bridgeheads transformed the war's tempo. Before Remagen, every major river crossing had demanded weeks of preparation. After Remagen, the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies poured armor across the Rhine within days. Field commanders noted that divisions advanced 40 miles farther than planned because the engineers never let the bridges fail. This speed unbalanced the German high command. Reports from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht described units retreating in confusion, unable to realign before being overrun. The American advance no longer followed the rhythm of war, it dictated it. For civilians along the Rhine, that change was tangible. Each morning brought the sound of hammers instead of artillery. Children watched convoys of trucks roll over repaired spans, their wheels thundering like a heartbeat through the valley. Farmers returned to ruined fields, realizing the river no longer marked fear, but food and supply. Women who once hid from bombers now handed bread to soldiers guarding the crossings. They had seen the same Americans destroy their factories and now watched them rebuild their future. The shift in perception was as psychological as it was material. Occupation began not with intimidation, but with construction. Within the German army, disbelief turned to resignation. Captured officers described an enemy immune to destruction, a phrase later quoted in Allied interrogation summaries. The idea that bridges could rise within hours shattered morale more than artillery barges ever could. Demolition, once a trusted delaying tactic, became a gesture of futility. Some commanders ordered their men to withdraw without blowing crossings, fearing the Americans would simply rebuild them anyway. The psychological front had shifted. The engineers had made destruction feel meaningless. Inside Allied command posts, the bridge miracle became a case study in logistics. General Eisenhower called it proof that preparation beats surprise. Reports from the Corps of Engineers recommended maintaining mobile bridging units in all future theaters, anticipating a world where speed would define strategy. American planners already envisioned the next wars, ones fought not just on fronts, but through supply networks that could rebuild themselves faster than they could be broken. The Rhine crossings were not just military victories. They were prototypes for a new era of mobility warfare. Behind the headlines, the human cost remained immense. Hundreds of engineers died securing those spans. Many drowned when pontoons capsized under tank weight or collapsed under shellfire. At Remagen, part of the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way on March 17th, killing 28 men. Survivors refused to abandon the work. Replacement sections were installed the same night, lit by flood lamps powered by portable generators. "We finished what they started," one corporal later said while welding in silence near the wreck. For them, the bridge was both monument and grave. In Washington, the War Department studied the operations data with forensic detail. The conclusion was revolutionary. The true power of modern warfare lay not in destruction, but in restoration. A tank could seize ground, but an engineer could make it permanent. That philosophy shaped post-war doctrine. When American officers drafted plans for Cold War contingencies, bridging battalions were prioritized alongside armor and aviation. NATO's rapid reaction concepts, decades later, drew their lineage from the engineers who turned the Rhine into a highway in 1945. The same principles, mobility, modularity, and redundancy, echoed through Korea, Vietnam, and even the Gulf War. The psychological echoes inside Germany lasted even longer. In post-war diaries, citizens described how their image of the enemy changed at the bridgeheads. One teacher from Cologne wrote that she first saw American soldiers not as conquerors, but as builders. The ruins of bridges became foundations for the Marshall Plan reconstruction, where explosives had severed towns, Bailey spans and concrete arches reconnected them. Children who had watched the engineers work would grow up crossing those same rebuilt structures to attend new schools and factories rising from rubble. The steel the Americans left behind became part of post-war Germany's skeleton. Among the engineers themselves, memory was complicated. Many spoke little of Remagen after returning home. Their war had been waged with rivets and torches, not rifles, yet the danger had been constant. In veterans' reunions years later, they joked that their medals were for not drowning. Yet beneath the humor was pride, a quiet recognition that they had altered the course of history through endurance rather than aggression. In letters preserved by families, one phrase appeared again and again: "We built so others could cross." It was both literal and spiritual. The legacy extended into technology. Wartime innovations in modular steel and portable power systems evolved into peacetime infrastructure. Bridge trusses developed for the Rhine crossings inspired designs for post-war expressways and flood control projects. Civil engineers returning from Europe applied combat lessons to civilian construction, emphasizing speed, adaptability, and prefabrication. Even the aluminum pontoons that once bore tanks across the river became models for emergency flood relief in the United States. The line between soldier and builder blurred permanently. In Germany, the memory of that speed lingered as awe tinged with disbelief. Elderly residents near Remagen would still tell visitors decades later how the Americans had rebuilt a river. Some kept fragments of steel as relics, polished smooth by years of touch. The bridge itself, though later destroyed, was commemorated by both nations. Where explosives once tore through its girders, a museum now stands, its walls covered with photographs of men in helmets wielding torches instead of guns. Schoolchildren walk through those halls hearing the same question whispered since 1945. How could anyone rebuild that fast? The answer, as historians later wrote, lay not in the steel but in the spirit behind it. American engineers carried an optimism that no bombardment could erase, the belief that problems, no matter how vast, were meant to be solved. That faith in machinery, organization, and human hands was the true secret weapon. To the Germans who witnessed it, the sight was both humbling and haunting. The war that had begun with destruction ended, for them. In the rhythm of construction, as the spring of 1945 unfolded, the Rhine crossings paved the path to the Elbe and the final collapse of the Reich. The bridges built by exhausted engineers became arteries for liberation columns, refugee convoys, and, eventually, peacekeepers. Where once flowed fear, now moved the machinery of recovery. The same hands that held torches would later pour concrete for schools, roads, and power stations. What began as an act of war had become a blueprint for rebuilding civilization itself. When the last American unit withdrew from the Rhine in the post-war years, the local towns rang their church bells not in mourning, but in gratitude. They were no longer stunned by how fast bridges could rise. They understood what that speed meant. It meant the world could be repaired. It meant that ruin was never final. It meant, simply, that human beings could choose to build instead of break. And in that choice, the sparks over the dark river, the clang of hammers beneath falling shells, lay the quiet, enduring truth of Remagen. The strongest bridge ever built was not made of steel, but of resolve.